When Samuel Brooks celebrated his 73rd birthday, he realized a simple truth. Fears are like old coats. While you wear them, they are heavy and uncomfortable. But once you take them off, you suddenly find it easy to breathe. That evening, he sat in his small house on the outskirts of a quiet town. A cup of hot tea sat before him, his cozy old armchair creaking softly beneath him. Few cars drove along the deserted streets outside, and somewhere in the distance, dogs barked lazily. Samuel watched the sunset paint the sky gold and smiled. He remembered how many years he had spent fearing the opinions of others, making mistakes, loneliness, and how, over time, these fears simply disappeared. Once, he thought life was a continuous race. You had to keep up, be liked, achieve. Now he knew life is a journey, and the less extra baggage you carry on your back, the further you can go. Today, Samuel will talk about 7 fears that lose their power over time. And perhaps, in these stories, you will recognize yourself. Stay with him until the end. You might find an unexpected feeling of lightness that you never knew existed before. Fear of public opinion. In his youth, Samuel Brooks always felt invisible eyes on him. He felt as if he was walking through life with a heavy suitcase full of other people's expectations. And the further he went, the heavier it became. At school, he was afraid to raise his hand in class, even when he knew the right answer. What if they said he was showing off? At university, he chose a major he didn't like, but one that was like everyone else's, just so he wouldn't hear that he was strange. And then, work, family, neighbors. Everywhere there was some kind of invisible stage, and Samuel was playing a role that had been imposed on him. He wore strict grey suits, although he secretly loved bright colors. He agreed to weekend trips when he dreamed of staying home with a book. He even chose his words carefully, like a sapper, just so as not to offend anyone with a casual phrase. And only over the years did he realize most people are so busy with their own fears and worries that rarely does anyone really judge you as carefully as you thought. He remembered how at 30 he spent a long time choosing a tie for a friend's wedding. For 3 evenings in a row, he thought, too bright, they'll laugh, too pale, they'll say it's tasteless. And then, at the wedding itself, no one even noticed what tie he was wearing. People drank, danced, talked about their own affairs. And Samuel then thought for the first time, for whom had he been trying so hard to be right all this time? But realization doesn't come instantly. The fear of public opinion is like the habit of holding your back straight under a heavy backpack, even if it's long been empty. Samuel truly felt the change at 73. One summer day, he went outside in a simple white shirt and old jeans, without a tie, without worrying about what anyone would think. A gentle breeze ruffled his shirt. The sun pleasantly warmed his shoulders. He walked down the sidewalk, and for the first time in many years, he felt like himself. Not who they wanted him to be, but who he was inside. He realized no one is obligated to understand him. No one is obligated to admire him, and that turned out to be liberating, almost a physical sensation. As if the armor he had worn all his life finally fell from his shoulders. Samuel recalled instances from the past when the fear of other people's opinions prevented him from living. He didn't go to dances in high school because he was shy about his awkward movements. He once refused to participate in an exhibition of his drawings. What if they laugh? He didn't ask a girl he'd been dreaming about for 6 months out on a date, fearing rejection. How much joy he lost then, simply because of fear, and how much more he would have lost if he hadn't finally decided to become free. Today, Samuel learned to enjoy simple things, wearing a bright hat to the store, saying a kind word to a stranger, refusing an invitation if he didn't want to go, without excuses, without fear of appearing strange. He understood that the opinions of others are like clouds in the sky. They come and go. Sometimes they hang like a heavy shadow, but you just have to wait a little, and the sun will shine again. Freedom from public opinion for Samuel became not just a psychological change, it was a return to his true self. To the boy who, as a child, laughed heartily, drew on the asphalt with colorful crayons, and didn't think about how anyone looked at him. Now, sitting on the porch in the evening with a cup of tea, he thought, how much extra weight I carried, and yet everything that truly matters I always had: kindness, curiosity about life, lightness of soul. Everything else is temporary. And if someone in the store cast a surprised glance in his direction, noticing his bright blue scarf, Samuel just smiled, because now he knew living for yourself is not selfishness. It is wisdom. If you relate to these reflections, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Here we together seek light at every age, share stories that warm the soul, and your like helps tell more people about this. Fear of mistakes and failures. When Samuel was younger, he perceived every mistake as a personal tragedy. A small slip-up seemed like the end of the world. If he accidentally made a mistake in a work report or forgot an important date, he worried as if he had let down not only himself, but the whole world around him. A mistake was a stigma for him, as if a sign immediately appeared on his forehead: loser. He remembered how at 28 he first took on the leadership of a project and failed. For months afterward, he avoided unnecessary conversations, feeling broken. It seemed then that one mistake crossed out everything good he had done before. But years went by, and life taught him to look at failures differently. Samuel especially remembered the story of his old friend, Harold. Harold was someone who was always considered reliable. He steadily worked at a bank for almost 40 years, and at 62, he suddenly took a risk. He opened a small coffee shop and failed. The location was bad, the rent was high. A year later, he closed the business at a loss. When Samuel met him on a walk, he expected to see a beaten man. But Harold was smiling. Sitting on a bench, sipping coffee from a thermos, he said, "The best decision of my life. Now I know for sure that trying was more important than fearing failure." And then Samuel thought for the first time, maybe a mistake is not a sign of defeat, but a sign that you are moving forward. Mistakes and failures were everywhere, in his own life, in the lives of his friends and his relatives. Caroline, his cousin, divorced at 30 after 10 years of marriage. She was ashamed of it for many years, hiding her loneliness behind work and chores. But after some time, she met a man with whom she became truly happy, and often said, "If it weren't for that failure back then, I would never have found my true life." Samuel understood. A mistake is not a dead end. It's a fork in the road. Sometimes you need to turn off the road to find a path that leads where we really want to be. At 73, he stopped judging himself harshly for mistakes. If he forgot to buy something at the store, he just laughed. If he burned toast, he joked about it to himself. He was no longer afraid to seem imperfect. He saw life is not made up of flawless decisions. It's like an old blanket. It has worn patches, uneven seams, but that's what makes it warm, familiar. Mistakes filled his life with stories, not shame. He remembered how he once accidentally took the wrong train and ended up in a small town where he met people with whom he then befriended for years. Or how once, in a hurry, he forgot to prepare a speech for a reunion, and instead of an official speech, he said simple, sincere words, for which he was later thanked. "Now," Samuel said, "mistakes are not blemishes on your reputation. They are traces of the fact that you are living. When a person is young, setbacks seem like failures. When a person grows older, he sees in them the shoots of future happiness." Samuel looked at his friends. Some discovered new hobbies after failures. Some changed cities. Some learned to say, "I didn't manage," without shame. And each of them became wiser, warmer, more alive. Mistakes make us real. And, sitting on the porch in the evening, Samuel thought, it's better to make mistakes and live than to be afraid and freeze in place. Fear of death. When Samuel was younger, the fear of death was like a shadow that always followed him, even though he tried not to notice it. At 20, he was sure there was an endless road ahead. At 30, he began to think about it when he heard about someone's illness. At 40, he sometimes woke up at night in anxiety, not understanding what exactly frightened him most. Death seemed something cold, frightening, unpredictable. It was somewhere out there, beyond the line of life, and it was better not to look in its direction. But the years went by, and fear gradually changed form. It didn't disappear immediately, like morning fog. It first became softer, quieter, and then clearer. One of the turning points for Samuel was the death of his old neighbor, Mr. Jenkins. He lived to be 91 years old. In his last days, he often sat on his porch, wrapped in a blanket, and looked at the garden. One day, Samuel approached him, and Mr. Jenkins, without taking his eyes off the fading autumn trees, said, "The most important thing is to manage to love everything that was. Then you leave without fear." These words stuck in Samuel's head. He thought about them a lot. He remembered how in his youth people avoided talking about death, as if it could be protected against, and older people, on the contrary, often wanted to talk, not out of gloom, but to put their souls in order. Gradually, Samuel understood. We are not afraid of death itself. We are afraid of incompleteness. We are afraid to leave without having said, "I love you," without hugging, without asking for forgiveness. He remembered the incident with Mary, his cousin. She couldn't forgive her father for old grievances for a long time, but a few days before his death, she still came, took his hand, and said, "I understand everything, and I love you." She later told Samuel that at that moment her own fear of death dissolved, as if a large, quiet space opened up in her soul. Samuel understood that death is not an enemy. It is a natural part of the same path he had been walking all his life. Now, he looked at familiar things differently. At the golden leaves in autumn, falling to the ground, calmly and beautifully. At old photo albums, where the faces of loved ones look with gentle sadness and warmth. At the sunset, which gives way to night without haste and fear. Death ceased to be the end in his eyes. It became a transition, like silence after a favorite melody. Sometimes in the evenings, he sat in his chair, drank tea and thought. Once I was afraid that I wouldn't have time for everything. Now I know you don't need to rush. You need to live fully every day. And this discovery gave him the lightness he had never even dreamed of before. He no longer drove away thoughts of the future. He even wrote several letters to his children and grandchildren in advance, not out of fear, but out of love. Letters about how proud he was of them, how happy he was, how he didn't regret anything. These letters lay in a desk drawer, next to photographs, old concert tickets, and his first poems. Now Samuel knew, while I live, death is not here, and when it comes, I won't be here any more, and there is peace in that too. He learned to meet each day as a gift, without clinging to it in despair. Life became easier, deeper, warmer, and in this was the true freedom he had never even suspected before. If you enjoy our conversation, don't forget to like it. It's like a silent nod. Yes, I'm here, and it's important for me to hear this. And if you want, share in the comments what resonated with you. Fear of financial hardship. All his life, Samuel Brooks was used to clinging to stability, as if to a life preserver. Even in his youth, he learned the main lesson of his time. Without money, you are nobody. This thought became ingrained in him so deeply that for many years he lived not for joy, but for confidence in tomorrow. He worked late, saved for a rainy day, saved on himself, fearing to be left without means. Every purchase, even a new shirt or a good dinner, turned into a prick of guilt. What if there's not enough later? Or, Yamabarusa, wa. When someone lost their job, or ran a business at a loss, Samuel felt not pity, but secret terror. This can happen to me, something whispered inside. The fear of poverty was like a silent companion, invisible, but heavy. And sometimes it interfered with enjoying life more than real difficulties. But the years went by, and after 70, Samuel suddenly began to see everything differently. First, he understood a simple thing. No amount of money can buy health, love, the respect of children, or long evenings when you laugh with friends about old stories. He remembered his old neighbor Peter, a humble teacher who received a small salary all his life. Peter never had his own house. He drove an old car, but he lived a life such that half the city came to his funeral. He was remembered for his kind heart, for his help, for his warmth. I saved money, Samuel thought then, and he saved memories. Which of us is richer? Secondly, he noticed that many fears were contrived. Yes, the pension wasn't luxurious. Yes, there were months when he had to choose between a new coat and a trip to see his grandchildren. But every time he chose the trip, he felt alive. He learned to appreciate simple joys. A cup of strong coffee on the morning porch. An old but comfortable pair of boots. The ability to give a gift to his granddaughter, perhaps inexpensive, but from the heart. Instead of clinging to every coin, he began to invest in moments, because it is moments, not money, that stay with us to the end. Once his grandson gave him a homemade card with the inscription, "Thank you for teaching me to laugh." And Samuel thought, this is true wealth. Now he treated money like the wind. They come and go. And no matter how hard you try to hold them in your hands, sooner or later, they will slip through your fingers. It's better to direct the wind into the sails and sail forward than to stand still, fearing storms. The fear of financial hardship disappeared, like unnecessary weight disappears from a suitcase before a long journey. He was no longer ashamed of his old coat. He wasn't afraid to ask for a discount in the store or to rejoice at a free concert in the park. He realized that wealth is not measured by bank accounts, but by how much love and warmth you manage to gather around you. Sometimes in the evenings, he remembered how he worried about every penny and smiled. I was so afraid of falling, and I should have learned to fly. Fear of loneliness. Iasuan. All his life, Samuel Brooks, like many, considered loneliness the worst of trials. It seemed to him that being alone meant being forgotten, to become invisible to the world, to lose significance. When he was young, loneliness was associated with empty rooms, A cold dinner at one table, long evenings without calls and visits. He saw how old people in his neighborhood sat by the windows, looking at the street, and thought, just don't let me end up like that. Therefore, he always strived to be surrounded by people, friends, colleagues, neighbors, even if the conversations were empty and the meetings were burdensome, just so as not to feel the emptiness. But over the years, his understanding of loneliness changed. It became for him not an enemy, but a friend. Not a scary empty house, but a space where you can hear yourself. A turning point came after the death of his wife, Margaret. The first months after her death were difficult. The house seemed too large, the silence too loud. Samuel tried to fill the void. He invited guests, visited distant relatives, enrolled in courses. But all this was like a plaster on a deep wound. One day he stayed home alone, without plans, without guests. He lit a table lamp, took out an old book he had been meaning to reread, poured himself a glass of wine, and suddenly felt a strange warmth. Not sadness, not despair, but peace. That night, he understood. Loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the ability to be with yourself without fear. Samuel began to notice. The brightest moments happen in silence. When he walks in the park and hears the wind rustling in the branches. When he writes a letter to an old friend, not expecting an immediate response. When he cooks himself a simple dinner, enjoying the aromas of the kitchen. He remembered his neighbor, Evelyn, a cheerful 80-year-old lady who single-handedly grew roses by her house. One day he asked her, "Aren't you lonely?" Evelyn laughed and replied, "Loneliness happens when the wrong people are around, and being alone with yourself is never boring." Samuel often thought about these words. He realized, loneliness is different. There is loneliness when you are forgotten, and there is loneliness when you have found peace within yourself. Now he was no longer afraid of evenings alone. He developed small rituals. He brewed his favorite tea with mint. He wrote a few lines in his diary about the past day. He watched old movies he loved in his youth, and each time he felt he was not alone. He was with himself, with his memories, dreams, thoughts. Sometimes his children and grandchildren came to visit. Sometimes friends called. But even in their absence, Samuel did not feel emptiness. He was no longer afraid of loneliness, because he understood. Those who have found support within themselves are never truly alone. And in the evenings, looking out the window at the starry sky, he thought, what happiness to be able to be at peace with yourself. Fear of lost youth and appearance. Fear of loss of physical attractiveness. When Samuel was still a young man, the world seemed to him a stage on which it was important to look flawless. He carefully chose ties, made sure his shoes shone, and his hair was styled like in advertising magazines. Appearance was his calling card, his passport to life, dates, interviews, the respect of others. Everything, it seemed, depended on how good he looked in the eyes of others. Decades passed, and one day, looking at his reflection in the window on an autumn morning, Samuel suddenly saw a completely different person. Silver strands at his temples, a slight heaviness in his movements, a face on which life had drawn its stories in thin lines. His first reaction was to turn away, as if he had caught himself off guard. But then he lingered, and for the first time truly saw not an old man, but a man who had come a long way. Samuel began to understand. Youth is not about smooth skin and light gait. It's about the inner light, about the liveliness in the eyes that doesn't fade with age. He remembered how in his youth He laughed at an old woman in the park who sang loudly without being embarrassed by those around her. Then he saw only wrinkles and a trembling voice. And now he remembered her and thought, what a beautiful soul she had. There was another person in Samuel's life who taught him to see true beauty, his old friend, Marion. She was over 80, but she wore bright shawls, gathered her hair in a coquettish bun, and greeted everyone as if that day was a holiday. Her face was covered with a network of wrinkles, but a smile made her surprisingly attractive. She didn't hide her age. She wasn't shy about it. On the contrary, as if she was saying, "Look how much life I carry within me." Samuel began to treat his body with gratitude. These hands held his children in his arms. These legs walked thousands of roads. These eyes saw the sunrises he once fell in love with. He stopped scolding himself for every new grey hair. He stopped looking in the mirror for confirmation of his worth. Instead, he learned to see in himself a whole universe of past stories. Now he was in no hurry to hide his age. He wore comfortable shirts, didn't chase fashion, didn't worry if his voice cracked. Instead, he told his grandchildren stories about his childhood, sang them old songs, and laughed so infectiously that he seemed younger than any young man. Samuel understood. True beauty is not what is seen with the eyes. It's what you feel with your heart, next to a person. When he walked down the street, he no longer looked for reflections in shop windows. He looked for meeting glances that responded to him with warmth, and he found them. And in the evenings, sitting in the garden, when the last rays of the sun fell on his face, he thought, I haven't lost myself. I have become myself. And that was the most wonderful discovery of his whole life. Fear of change. Most of all in his youth, Samuel Brooks feared change. They seemed to him something uncontrollable, like a storm at sea. You build your small world out of habits and plans, and changes suddenly swoop down and tear away everything you have been collecting for so long. He grew up in a family where stability was considered the highest virtue. The same walls, the same streets, the same orders. The slightest deviation from the usual caused anxiety. Changing jobs, a risk, moving to another area, madness, making new friends, almost a betrayal of old ones. In this picture of the world, changes were the enemy, not the road. And so, Samuel lived for many years. He clung to the familiar, as if to a life preserver in a stormy sea of life. Even when his younger brother Michael decided to move overseas, to Canada, to start a new life, Samuel looked at him with anxiety. How can you give up everything? What if it doesn't work out? Years passed, and changes still caught up with him, whether he wanted it or not. Margaret, his wife, once decided to open a small bakery. Samuel was afraid that this would lead to problems. Why risk it when you can live peacefully? But Margaret was different. She believed that changes bring growth. And to his surprise, her venture brought joy, not only to her, but to their entire, small community. The small shop always smelled of fresh bread, and new acquaintances and friendships were made over a cup of coffee. Then Samuel thought for the first time, maybe not all changes bring destruction. Maybe some of them are like the first spring rain. Yes, it disrupts the usual peace of winter, but only to revive the earth. After Margaret's death, changes entered his life in a stormy stream. The house where they had lived for 40 years suddenly became too quiet. Old friends came to visit less and less often. Even going to his favorite supermarket suddenly turned out to be more difficult than before. Everything was different, and there was no point in resisting any more. Samuel made a decision that 5 years earlier would have seemed impossible to him. He sold his large house and moved to a small cottage on the outskirts of town. At first, he was scared. It seemed that he was losing a part of himself, leaving behind old walls and well-worn paths. But gradually, his new life acquired its own music. Morning walks along unfamiliar streets, new neighbors who gladly brought him pies for Christmas, leisurely conversations in a small library over a cup of coffee. He realized, change is not a storm that destroys life. It is the wind that can unfurl your sails if you don't cling to the old pier. There was one moment that Samuel remembered especially vividly. His old friend Harold, a man even more cautious and conservative than himself, once visited him in his new home. Harold, looking around the cozy living room with bookshelves and flowers on the windowsill, quietly said, "You know, I was afraid that you wouldn't cope here. And now I see you've only gotten younger." Samuel smiled, not because he managed to deceive age or avoid losses, but because he understood. Accepting changes means opening up a new road for yourself, instead of clinging to a closed door until the very end. Now, he didn't hide from change. He met them with curiosity, like an old sailor who knows. Beyond the horizon, there is always another land, another sunrise. And in this acceptance was that rare, deep taste of freedom, which he had so feared in his youth, and which he finally learned to appreciate in maturity. Many years have passed since Samuel Brooks first thought about old age. In his youth, it seemed to him the end of the journey, a time when everything important was already behind him. It seemed that with age, life becomes quieter, dimmer, poorer. But now, looking back, he saw a completely different picture. Old age brought him not an end, but liberation. It stripped him of the heavy garments of fear. Fear of mistakes, fear of the opinions of strangers, fear of change and loss. What seemed frightening in youth became understandable, and sometimes even necessary over the years. Samuel learned to live without looking back, to accept himself as he was, not to build castles in the air from expectations, and not to burden his heart with what had long since passed. He understood that the greatest art is not to hold on to time, not to cling to the illusions of youth, but to be able to be alive in every day of his life, however quietly and simply it may begin. When the wind rustled the curtains in his small house on warm evenings, and the sunset filled the sky with gold, Samuel sat in his old armchair, covered with a blanket, and thought, everything that seemed like a loss to me turned out to be liberation. Everything I feared led me to this peace. He was no longer afraid of loneliness, because in silence he found himself. He was not afraid of death, because he understood the value of every moment lived. He was not afraid of being ordinary, because in simplicity lay great strength. Old age made him not weak, but free. Free from other people's expectations, from unnecessary regrets, from the endless struggle for appearance. And when someone asked him, "What is it like to live, knowing that most of the journey is already behind you?" he just smiled quietly and answered, It's like sitting by a campfire at the end of a long hike. You no longer strive to run anywhere. You just bask in its light and thank the path for everything it has given you. In this light flickered memories, warmth of meetings and partings, the smells of rains and blooming gardens, the laughter of children, and the rustle of pages of long read books. And somewhere there, in the depths, he knew, life is not measured in years. It is measured by how many times you allowed yourself to be alive. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel. Here they cherish every moment lived and every smile. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'm always happy to look there, as if visiting old friends.